All right, I see that it's 9:30. I see that a few more people are dropping in, but we'll go ahead and get started because we have so much wonderful information from our presenters today that we want to give them the benefit of all the time that we can. So welcome to the webinar. Today, our topic is assessment of multilingual students with exceptional needs and navigating between the tiers of instruction. And this webinar is offered by the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project, and it is funded by the California Department of Education through the Napa County Office of Education. All right. We will have, we'll be asking you to join us, even though it's a webinar format. We really would like for you to chime in. You can use the chat box throughout our time together. Our presenters are very attentive to the chat box and will respond to any questions or concerns that you see. Also, you will want to use the drop-down menu in the chat box to select all panelists and attendees if that's on your screen, or it might say everyone, so that everyone can see your questions and comments. And also, during the webinar, we will invite you to complete a couple of polls. So if you just keep an eye out for that, you know, that pops up as a separate screen. Wanted to let you know that the PowerPoint slides are in a participant folder, and Kian is going to put that into chat. There are two links, one to Google Drive and one to Dropbox, depending on which works for you best. And our presenters have a multitude of links, which are all live in the PowerPoint slides in that Dropbox or Google folder, and they will also be posted in chat. So you will be getting quite a bit of information today. I would like to let you know, you probably heard it when you joined, that we are recording this, and we will make these webinars available after they're complete. So we do record them and they become part of our project's learning library. So if you have others who you wish had been here and would like to share the information with them, the link will be coming out to you and anyone who is registered in the next few weeks. All right, I would like to introduce our presenters now. Both of our presenters are coordinators of inclusionary practices at the Imperial County SELPA. They are members of the Imperial County SELPA Content Lead Team, improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. And they bring over 20 years of experience, each of them do, in education focused on English learners. I'd like to introduce to you Lupita Olguin-Rubio. Lupita has extensive experience as a curriculum coordinator, providing professional development on topics related to English learners' literacy and their language development at the Imperial County Office of Education. And she believes that multilingualism is an asset and that every student is entitled to have his or her voice valued and heard. She also operates with a systems lens and recognizes that as educators, we're all change agents and have the capacity and the ability to contribute to the transformation of our school systems to improve outcomes for all learners. And may I introduce to you Vanessa Lopez. Vanessa's background is in educating English learners with disabilities in resource and self-contained classroom settings, and she enjoys working towards shining a light on the myriad of assets that English learners, students with disabilities, and those dually identified contribute to our education system and our community. She believes in being a change agent and an advocate for all students, and in the commitment and zeal educators in the field bring to their classroom setting every day. So welcome, Lupita and Vanessa. We look forward to deepening our learning and providing assessment and supports for English learners. This is an extension of the webinar that you did a year ago, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much, SPP-TAP team. We appreciate being here, and we love connecting with practitioners statewide and making new friends. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. So know that one of our anchor resources, if not the anchor resources for our first iteration of our grant, was the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. I want to point out that this is not just any publication, but rather a compendium that follows the arc from identification as an English learner to pre-referral strategies, processes, assessment, the IEP development process, potential exit from special education services, and potential reclassification of students who are dually identified. Know that the guidance that is provided within the document and also in the slides that we're going to be sharing with you are not binding on local educational agencies other than those specific statutes, regulations, and court decisions that are referenced. The document is exemplary, and compliance with it is not mandatory. However, best practices are shared throughout, and that is exactly what we intend to do for you today. So before we move forward, I think it's critical that we set the context as to the why. So this graphic may be something new for some of you that are not familiar with statistics related to English learners with disabilities, multilingual students with exceptional needs. And for some of you that inhabit both worlds because you wear multiple hats, this is nothing new. However, I think it's important for us to highlight that out of all the students in California who have met eligibility criteria in one or more of the 13 distinct disability categories, nearly 25% are English learners. 75% are not classified as English learners, 25% are. So I'm going to be planting a little bit of data nuggets to set the context for our conversation in relation to the navigation between the tiers of instruction, and also between culturally responsive valid assessment processes to ensure that we're using appropriate data to provide supports for our students who are dually identified. So keep those little nuggets in mind because we're going to be connecting the dots throughout our time together today. So before I move forward with another one of our data points, I want to share with you two bits of terminology that you're going to see in the upcoming slide. So here we are looking specifically at the two categories of EL, right? Long-term English learner and at risk of being a long-term English learner, or you might hear it as LTEL or at-risk LTEL. So it's important for us to know what these terms mean specifically and what they mean to our relative role in this realm of serving students who are dually identified. So a long-term English learner is an English learner who has been enrolled 6 or more years in U.S. schools and has been receiving instruction that is inclusive of comprehensive ELD, and is not making adequate progress. They remain an English learner despite consistent instruction in with comprehensive ELD, with the ELD standards included. And we typically see this label begin to pop up in relation to our English learners around grades 6 through 12, which makes sense when we look at the enrollment of 6 or more years. Typically, that's when we will see it, which is why a lot of our middle schools and high schools are having conversations around long-term English learners. Then we have at risk of long-term English learners. So an at-risk long-term English learner is inclusive of English learners who have been enrolled more than 4 or 5 years and are not making adequate progress to be potential candidates for reclassification. And we typically see this between grades 3 through 12. Again, because by then we're starting to pick up some patterns of maybe some level of just not seeing that increasing slope towards attaining English language proficiency. All right, so I gave you that bit of background information so that this graph makes a little bit more sense. So the very first graph you'll see to my left as I'm facing the screen is one to all English learners statewide. English learners in the state of California, 46% are reclassified as fluent English proficient. So out of all the English learners in the state of California, 24% are ages 0 to 3, are littles, right? 10% are at risk of becoming long-term English learners. So I'm looking at this graph right here. 18% are long-term English learners, and 2% are not at risk of becoming LTEL, meaning that there's evidence of making some adequate progress. However, as we shift our attention over to this graph, we see that the numbers begin to change, and in some instances, quite drastically. I want to call your attention to RFIP for all English learners statewide versus the RFIP category for our English learners with disabilities, meaning our students who are dually identified. 27% in comparison to the 46% of our English learners statewide. 27% only meet redesignation criteria to then fully be reclassified as fluent English proficient. Of our students ages 0 to 3 who have a disability, 18% are identified as being English learners. 13% are at risk of becoming long-term English learners. 2% are not at risk of becoming a long-term English learner, which is comparable to English learners statewide. However, when we look at long-term English learners, 40%, that is more than double of what that number is for our English learners statewide. So what can be extracted, what can be understood, and how might the impact of over-identification be illustrated in these graphs? We're curious to know what your thoughts are. Please utilize the chat feature to share with us how might the impact of over-identification be illustrated in these graphs. Makes you think, makes you wonder, gut instinct, further confirms a held belief. How might the impact of over-identification be illustrated in these graphs? I'll give you a couple of seconds more. Okay, so great comments here. It looks as if EL students are being over-identified at SPED because the test may be English-based. Are we really targeting needs? Makes us wonder about possible inappropriate SPED evaluations. Large number of ELs related to a disability, maybe lack of language during testing, maybe not a learning disability, but a language issue. Absolutely. So Susan shared with you earlier as she was introducing Lupita and I that my background is in your quote unquote RSPSDC classes. So I taught at a local K-6 elementary school for 18 years. And one of the things that I noticed was a lot of the things that all of you are mentioning in the chat, right? Some level of concern related to the assessment process. But also one of the points that really stuck with me, and if we have any special ed practitioners, meaning teachers that have seen this, and what I want to share is this, is that it seemed that once a student was receiving special education as a service, because that's the intention, right? Special education as a service, it became understood, and I use air quotes because it really was, it was just an assumption that all needs, including ELD, would be taken care of within the special education classroom, right? So that also makes us have to stop, pause, and process what some of those implications are. And we'll get in a little bit deeper into that as we move forward, because these are like important, super important points for us to stop, pause, and ponder, because they have a direct impact in the over-identification of students statewide. So this graph is not shocking. We know that statewide Spanish is the home language of most of our multilingual learners. And the reason we highlight this pie graph is because this has a direct impact in our assessment tools. I'm sure that many of you are having no issue finding an assessment in Spanish, batería, any one of those assessments that have a Spanish counterpart. However, it might be a little bit more challenging to find one in Chaldean, right? So one of the reasons why we share this graphic is just to really call out the fact that for some of us in our respective areas, it's no issue because the majority of our English learners are Spanish speakers and we have a tool for them, a diagnostic tool, an assessment tool. However, it becomes a bit challenging for some of our other students that speak other languages and or dialects. So when we're looking at the over-identification question, these are the top 3 disability categories for which students who are English learners are identified. So just to recap, there's 13 distinct disability categories. 14 if you count established medical disability as one of the newer additions to it. But 43.97, 44% of students who are English learners who meet eligibility criteria for special education services do so under the category specific learning disability, SLD. Around 21% for speech or language impairment, and 14% for autism. What about these statistics gives you pause? Considering the graphs we noted, some of the data points I shared, some of the feedback in the chat, what about these statistics gives you pause? Share in the chat, please. I'll give you a couple of seconds. SLD, right. Speech assessments, the SLI percentage, heavy language testing. Language intense. Thought autism might be higher. Processing disorders, language issue versus disability, teasing that out. And then as you're sharing your feedback in the chat, do these percentages reflect the students with disabilities who are also English learners in your schools? It can either be a yes, no, or an I don't know if you're not privy to these numbers.
We have about half of the people responding so far, so we'll give it a couple of seconds before we see the results. Okay, let me share the results with everyone.
All right, so around 47% of you said that yes, pretty much what you encounter in your day-to-day. 13% said no, and 41% said I don't know. And that I don't know is absolutely okay. Lupita and I always like to say that when we come together with practitioners statewide, we don't like to simply say that we're providing a safe space. We're providing a brave space where we can share and be reflective, because that's the only way that things can actually be addressed as they should, right? By being open, reflective, and saying, you know what, I don't know sometimes. However, don't let that be your only response, but start thinking, I don't know right now. Who might I ask? Who is the holder of this information? Because a really great question was asked in the chat is like, how does this compare to our non-English learner population? Is it consistent to what we see for students who are not English learners. And that would be critical for you to know, not just from the 30,000-foot view of statewide data, but local data, because it's really at your individual sites where some of these discussions are going to happen, and we need actionable data, which means local data, current data, for you to make some moves as you begin to plan out how we might address navigating the tiers of instruction and intervention, ensuring that we are having equitable practice for all multilingual students with disabilities. So just with a quick show of hands, how many of you are SPED background, SPED teachers, SPED admin? Look at the participant list. Okay, so we have how many? Okay. So quite a few of you. Okay, so I never like to take anything for granted, because this work is really the work that is based around the concept of the team lift. So Lupita's background is Gen Ed, ELD specifically, mine is special education. So I try not to take anything for granted. Why? Because it is important for us to have a common understanding of what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about disabilities that have a language impact, and especially as we're considering issues of over-identification and how to best support students so we don't get there in navigating those tiers of instruction and intervention. So a specific learning disability, SLD, is a disability that is basically a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language. Whoa, language, right? A lot of you touched on that in the chat when we were reflecting earlier. Understanding or in using language, be it spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. And this is inclusive of conditions like perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. So, seeing this definition on your screen, considering issues of over-identification and language-heavy assessment, I want you to consider the following. What does this have to do, or how might this impact the assessment of English learners, and how might it not? Again, brave space, share what you're thinking. If you're not clear, it's okay, you can sit this one out. But what might this definition have as an impact on English learners? And how might we say, well, no, not really. No, it doesn't. And as you're sharing in the chat, I'm going to move on to the second portion of this definition, but keep typing, please. I love reading your feedback. So as you're typing about how might that initial definition of SLD impact over identification issues for multilingual students, we also want to point out that when we're talking about SLD, we are also indicating that a severe discrepancy between measures of intellectual ability and one or more of the following areas present deficits: oral expression, written expression, listening comprehension, basic reading skills, mathematics calculation, reasoning, comprehension, and fluency. Same question. How might this impact multilingual students? How might it not? Thinking. Let's add another layer to the definition of SLD. We're also saying that if a student meets eligibility criteria for SLD, that the severe discrepancy is related to a processing disorder in one or more of the following areas: attention, visual processing, auditory processing, phonological processing, sensory motor skills, and cognitive abilities, including association, conceptualization, and expression. Let me pop open the chat. Language. It's too easy to show low academic skills, especially post-COVID. Categorizing English learners in SLD when they might be fluent in their first language. Expressive and receptive language. Process information in a variety of ways. Absolutely, absolutely. So how might it impact? Well, it might impact our students who are English learners when they are being referred for assessment, thinking, you know what, I'm pretty sure there's a disability because, gosh darn it, I'm seeing difficulty in spoken and written language and in their ability to listen, think, and speak. And definitely in written expression, absolutely in reading comprehension and reading fluency. However, when we get here to this portion, the severe discrepancy must be related to one or more of the following areas. And as some of you pointed out in the chat, what is the role of primary language here? If the disability is true, it will exist in the primary language, in the home language. Think of all the other disability categories. They are consistent throughout. A student who is on the spectrum will be on the spectrum regarding whatever language it is that it's spoken, regardless of any environment. Same thing with SLD. If that disability is present, it will be evident in all realms and in all languages. And important for us to know and highlight is that when it's not a specific learning disability, what is not SLD? When it's due to limited school experience or poor attendance, environmental, cultural difference, or economic disadvantage, intellectual disability or emotional disturbance, and limited English proficiency. These are not SLD. Considering extrinsic factors, one of the important steps that we must consider when making those determinations of eligibility. Now, autism. When we're looking at autism as a spectrum, as a disability category, we know that autism is a developmental disability that, here we go, significantly affects verbal and nonverbal communication, social interaction, and it's generally evident before age 3, therefore, developmental disability, which adversely affects educational performance. Other characteristics that are often associated with autism are repetitive activity, stereotype movements, resistance to environmental change, unusual responses to sensory experiences. However, it does not apply if the child's educational performance is impacted by an emotional disturbance. But if we go back to this very first paragraph, we're talking about verbal and nonverbal communication. And this is particularly interesting when we're looking at our young ones, right? Our littles that are in the process of developing language. And when we are looking at how autism manifests in our younger students, there might be some overlap on what it looks like to the untrained eye when a student is learning that second language and engaging in a preschool environment, trying to learn by observing, trying to learn the social rules and contexts, trying to explore their environment. So it's important for us to consider the role of child development and also what the autism disability category truly means. Another important point that we want to consider when we're looking at autism is that only 31% of students with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, have an intellectual disability. And this is important for us to highlight for some of our peers who might live under the assumption that all students who are on the autism spectrum have an intellectual disability as well. In fact, only 31% of our students who meet eligibility criteria for ASD have an intellectual disability. 25% are in the borderline range, and 44% have IQ scores in the average to the above average range. We went ahead and we linked a couple of resources here on this slide that are available for you to either read yourself or to share out with peers who may have some questions regarding autism, especially if you are connecting often with peers who are assessors, who may not necessarily be bilingual assessors, but you want to make sure that they have as much information to at their fingertips for them to consider as they are engaging with students for assessment purposes, whether it be through the navigation of the tiers of instruction and intervention or formal assessment for special education. So then we come to SLI, speech or language impairment. So when we talk about SLI specifically, this is a communication disorder, such as, but not limited to, stuttering, impaired articulation, language impairment, or a voice impairment. In order to meet educationally based criteria for SLI, it must adversely affect a child's educational performance. So some of the attributes might be that the speech or language skills are noticeably behind their peers. English learners, they're a little bit behind. Inability to express ideas. Some of our English learners might demonstrate that. Improper use of words and their meanings. Receptive language disorder may have difficulties with understanding what is being said to them. A reduced vocabulary. Inability to follow directions. Problems with the way sounds are formed. So we can begin to see how it might be really difficult for an individual who is assessing a student when the individual doing the assessment is not familiar with what the English language acquisition process looks like for students who are multilingual learners that are being considered for either interventions and or potential assessment for special education. We want to make sure that we're not hasty in our referrals, but rather take our time considering first best instruction during tier 1 instruction, and then further moving on through the tiers of instruction, tier 2, tier 3, before making that referral for special education. So I will leave you with this information for you to keep in mind as Lupita walks us through first best instruction, tiers of instruction and intervention. But before that, we have a poll, and I'll hand it over to you, Lupita.
Thanks, Vanessa. I was responding in the chat, so forgive me for this slight delay. Okay, folks. So up to this point, we've hopefully we've been able to set the context for what we're talking about today. We want to be able to draw a clear line between how important it is to consider the tiers of instruction and intervention, what that might look like, where might there be opportunities to improve or enhance these systems so that we can gather the information that we need, put it together, and paint a clear picture of what our English learners who are struggling may truly need, as well as our English learners who already have an IEP, and therefore us being able to provide the appropriate linguistic supports along with their supports necessary based on their disability category. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, still staying on the path, but just really focusing in on our supports for English learners. So we're going to start with this poll question. Can a special education teacher provide integrated and designated ELD? Give us a yes or a no. And it's okay if you're not really sure. But I think our options are only yes or no. We'll just give it a few seconds.
Looks like answers are still pouring in, so I'll give them a couple more seconds before I release the results.
Thank you. Can a special education teacher provide integrated and designated ELD to English learners? as part of their special education services.
Okay, here come the results.
Fantastic. The majority of you voted yes. Some of you voted no. So let's see. Again, we're in a brave space here, so we appreciate your responses. Next slide, please. Yes. Thanks, Vanessa. The answer is yes. Certificated special education teachers who have their English learner authorization may provide both designated and integrated ELD. The bottom part of that response is something that we, Vanessa and I, when I say we, most of the time I mean Vanessa and I, that we aspire to and really hope that more and more practitioners who engage in our training and in any training related to English learners with disabilities engage in, and which is co-teaching. We hope that when a special education teacher with an authorized credential feels equipped to provide designated and integrated ELD during special education services, we hope that that is the norm. However, we find ourselves, at least in this work for these past 5 years, that has been a bit of a challenge for different reasons. However, co-teaching may be a way to enhance services for English learners with disabilities. So the short of it is that, yes, absolutely, special education teachers who have this English learner authorization, which most teachers graduating from California Institutes of Higher Education have, they graduated with a CLAD credential, which means you are authorized to teach English learners or multilingual learners. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So in order, again, to further set the context for our focus in these next slides, which really are about what is comprehensive ELD, what do English learners with disabilities deserve to receive in terms of instruction and supports, we're going to start this next few slides with this video clip. In preparation for the video clip, we have this question that will help kind of set the stage for what we want you to be thinking about. Be listening for similar trends in your school. What during the video are things that are familiar to you based on your experience at the school or schools that you are working in? We need sound, Vanessa. Vanessa, we can't hear it. I think you have to unmute.
Folks who don't understand that a child who's in.
Thank you.
I could talk for a long time about the issue of English language learners in special education, but I wanted to make 2 key points for educators to understand. In many districts, there are folks who don't understand that a child who's an English language learner, as well as one who could benefit from special education, is actually entitled to the protections of federal law on the basis of both statuses. So an English language learner is entitled to ESL, and a special ed child is entitled to special ed assistance. And if you have an English language learner who is also special ed, they're entitled to both. I recognize that that can be very difficult to implement, but the child does have the right to gain language proficiency in English, as well as the services that would be provided in a special education context. Another point is, if you're testing a child for special education who's not proficient in English, and you're testing that child in English, you're not really testing the special education issue, because they may not be understanding the question, not because of cognitive issues, but because of their lack of English language proficiency. This can be a difficult issue for school districts to deal with and to manage, but it's very important that administrators and teachers be sensitive to the language of the instrument that they're using to test for special education, because they may be testing language proficiency rather than an auditory problem, a cognitive problem, or something else.
I believe there's there you go. So we have a question that's going to help kind of pull together perhaps some of the ideas that are swirling around in your mind as we listen to this video clip. So what do you want to explore further regarding how English learners, student with disabilities, students receive support in your schools? The gentleman in the video touched upon a couple of key topics that Vanessa kind of walked us through or led us through. One of which is the role of primary language as it pertains to assessment. Another one has to do with English language development and acquisition. Can you move to the next slide, Vanessa, please? I'm going to walk you through what are some of the key features and considerations and behaviors of what the progression of ELD continuum looks like for all English learners, for English learners with a disability, for English learners who are struggling, and English learners who are progressing. So there is a general progression of English language continuum. This figure 3.3, can be found in our California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. And it's a resource that we use to help kind of paint a picture of what language acquisition could look like. It is not an exhaustive list or description of each one of the phases in language acquisition. However, it does help us really think about and look at what language output looks like for English learners and also for English learners with disabilities, and some key considerations as well. So this first slide we see, can you go back real quickly? The native language, right? A native language learner will use his or her primary language to either express what he or she knows and also to begin to make connections with the first language. So again, using the primary language as a way to develop the second language, in this case, English. So we'll see kiddos using words in their primary language and connecting the words in English that they are learning. The second phase is the emerging level. And at this stage, students are progressing very quickly in English for the purpose of immediate needs: bathroom, water, pencil, chair, teacher. These are some of the words that you're going to see and hear students use and learn very quickly as it relates to their everyday academic world and function. The next level is the expanding level. And at the expanding level, we're going to begin to see an increase in English knowledge, skills, and abilities. We'll begin to see kiddos going from words to phrases to maybe some short sentences. They're incorporating a variety of academic vocabulary that they are being exposed to across the content and curriculum. And their language, their grammatical structures are becoming more and more complex, and they're manipulating them to be able to express both in written and spoken language. At the bridging level, an English learner is absolutely showing more proficiency in all of the domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. We'll see more of it. It'll be displayed more strongly in the reading and writing domains. Here, students are using more academic language in written and in oral form for the purpose of school activities, right? So academic tasks. And we begin to see kiddos using language that is comparable to their English-only speaking peers with minimal or no linguistic support. And the final phase that is described here in figure 3.2 is the lifelong language learner phase. And I use myself an example for this phase because I am an English learner. I learned English in school. I started to learn English in kindergarten. My parents are immigrants, so there was no English spoken at home. So at this point, students have reached full proficiency in the English language. However, we are still acquiring vocabulary based on topics that are unfamiliar to us. And the reason that I say I use myself an example is, as I was introduced today, you might have caught that I do not have a special education background. So there was a lot of terminology, a lot of concepts that were unfamiliar to me as a result of me not having a background in this content. And so I am a lifelong language learner in that I was learning terminology and vocabulary and concepts in this new content that I was unfamiliar with. And so I guess that would make us all lifelong language learners if we are engaging in or studying or even going to a different country, right? You are using your primary language to access the language that you are living in, engaged in. But again, this notion of this natural progression of English language continuum is true for all English learners. It's important to note a couple of things, and this is critical information for us to remember and to consider as we are working with students and trying to support their needs to determine whether or not they need to be assessed for special education services. As students are learning English, they may show proficiency in some domains versus others. For example, you might notice that kiddos are picking up verbal skills quickly, yet their writing skills are not at the same proficiency level per se. This is typical, common, and quote unquote normal description or manifestation of learning English as a second language for any English learner. This is also true for an English learner with disability and should not be considered a result of the student's disability, as it should not be considered a disability for an English learner who is learning English. It is typical manifestation of English language acquisition. And the more that we know and understand about English language acquisition to inform our practices and our respective roles, the more effective we're going to be in, number one, providing the appropriate linguistic supports for English learners. Number two, providing the important linguistic and academic supports based on the student's goals if an English learner has an IEP. And absolutely, it will have an impact on how we assess and what types of assessment tools we use to gather information of whether or not the student needs to be supported through special education services. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about comprehensive ELD as it is part of Tier 1 core instruction. So I just want to call it out right away that comprehensive ELD is not an intervention for English learners. Neither is it an intervention for English learners with disability. Comprehensive ELD, as per Title III regulations, is a required course, if you will, for English learners, including English learners with disabilities. So all English learners must receive comprehensive ELD. And in California, comprehensive ELD is comprised of two types of ELD instruction. Next slide, please. Those two types of ELD instruction are integrated ELD and designated ELD. It's not either or, it's both. So all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, shall receive comprehensive ELD in the form of integrated and designated. What is integrated ELD? The purpose of integrated ELD is to provide access to the content area, to provide access to math, science, social studies, language arts. Through the ELD standards, what is taken into consideration is the student's language proficiency. So the student's language proficiency is considered, the ELD standards are utilized, and the content, science, math, social studies, is scaffolded based on the student's proficiency level using the ELD standards. So this happens across the instructional day for all English learners. Designated ELD. Designated ELD, as stated here, is protected time. It's its own block of time, like math, like science, like social studies. The purpose of designated ELD is to provide direct instruction of English language development for the purpose of English language acquisition. The ELD standards are utilized as the focal standards, meaning we are focusing specifically on English language development based on the student's language proficiency level. There's no mix of language proficiency level. So both of these types of English language development are necessary and critical in order for a student, an English learner, to gain access and to gain English language acquisition so that they are able to progress linguistically and academically. Without comprehensive ELD as part of their Tier 1 core instruction, it's safe to say that students will have some gaps in language and some gaps in academics as a result of poor or subpar comprehensive ELD during their instructional day. Next slide. we've plugged in this resource that I think we might just have a little bit of time to explore with, but we wanted to share it with you because we've used it for many professional development opportunities, and the information, the feedback that we get is that it's a really good way to help folks understand what comprehensive ELD is. So we're going to let you explore it, but let me tell you what it is first. It is a way for us to make concrete and establish some common understanding of what comprehensive ELD is and what it isn't. And thanks, Vanessa, for popping it open. So it's a way for you today, and for perhaps you're an administrator and you want to share this with staffs, to begin to have a conversation about what comprehensive ELD is and what it might look like, or where might you need to enhance at your respective sites. So we're going to give you, if somebody can drop the link into the chat box, we'll give you about 3 minutes to explore the Venn diagram, start moving the tiles the way Vanessa is modeling here, and start placing them in the place that you think they belong, whether it's an characteristic or description of integrated ELD or designated ELD, and both. So we'll give you, let's put 3 minutes on the clock. And again, you won't have a sufficient time to finish. We just want you to become familiar with it. And then we'll come back and debrief it shortly. Thank you, Kian.
Twenty seconds remaining.
Thanks, Vanessa. So as you can see here, we have the beginning of a debrief for our comprehensive ELD Venn diagram activity. However, I want to address a couple of questions in the chat just before we do the quick debrief, although some of the questions will be addressed in the debrief as well. So Marianne, could RSP services be provided in the student's primary language along with receiving designated and integrated ELD? So primary language support is different than primary language instruction. So yes, primary language support absolutely can be offered to any English learner, including an English learner with disability. It does not mean it is a direct translation of everything that is happening. However, it is the use of the student's primary language to be able to make instructions accessible so that the student is able to show what they know with ease and where English is being inserted. So maybe the student responds, and give you a brief example, maybe the student responds in the primary language, when the directions are in English. So it tells you the student is understanding, but doesn't have all of the words in English yet to be able to express it. So that is a way to be able to utilize primary language as a way to support. I hope that is clear. Primary language can be used to support, but that is different than primary language instruction, which is moving into Raul's question about dual immersion programs. So his question is, are there different guidelines for dual immersion programs in regards to ELD? Is it the same? Not either or, but both. Absolutely. It is both for all English learners. This is a Title III federal requirement in the state of California and all over the nation for all English learners to receive English language development. In the state of California, English language development, as described in Title III, is designated and integrated. So irregardless of the language program, dual immersion program, all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, shall receive comprehensive ELD in the form of integrated and designated. And then Mary had a question, with Spanish speaking students, the only focus is determining special education eligibility is on language acquisition without any consideration of culture, which is also a component of the child's ability to, yes, to profit from available services in the educational system. Yes, this is when we talk about pre-referral, when we do our presentation on pre-referral, we lay heavy on extrinsic factors, the student's health, trauma, food insecurity, other factors, not just cultural factors. Perhaps they live with family and their parents in the process of immigrating, so it's, unfamiliar. And all of these factors have an impact on the student's academic progress. So those are also considerations and very important data to gather along with academic data. So yes, I agree with you 100%. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the debrief. We'll come back to the questions because I know we're kind of racing against the clock at this point, and we want to make sure that we give you all the resources we've prepared for you today. So real quickly, again, this is not an exhaustive list of comprehensive ELD. It's just a way to get us on the same page, if you will, and begin to have conversations about what does this look like, where might we need to enhance, and what type of support do we need as adults? Maybe we need training, maybe we need to collaborate, maybe we need to explore co-teaching. So on the left side of the Venn is the integrated ELD description. So integrated ELD again happens across the instructional day, all day, above and beyond designated ELD. The lessons are driven by content demand, meaning we're focusing on science, social studies, mathematics, and the ELD standards are utilized to support linguistically based on the student's language proficiency level. Because it's integrated and because it's designed to provide access, the content and we have to focus on content and language objective. The content math, maybe it's a particular math skill or concept that needs to be taught. And then the language objective is the consideration that we have for the English learners that are in our classroom. Maybe the majority of our kiddos are emerging level students. And so we're utilizing the emerging level standards in the ELD standards to scaffold a good part of our lesson and also taking into consideration other levels. But I always my method is always, who do I have the most? I start there and then I scaffold further based on the other proficiency levels in my classroom. It is for any and all students. And this always kind of raises a question. What do you mean any for all students? I thought it was only for ELs. Yes, integrated ELD is a required type of ELD instruction for English learners. But because it happens in the content area across the curricula, you're going to have other students who are not English learners, EOs, in the classroom. So the linguistic scaffolds that you provide are specifically designed for your English learners. However, all kiddos may have access to those supports. They don't need them, but they might utilize them. And this is how we provide integrated ELD in a content area. We scaffold the lesson with the English learner in mind, utilize the strategies throughout the instructional day, and all students will have access to them. And again, the ELD standards are used along with the content standards. The next click will show our designated ELD characteristics. So here the focus is English language acquisition. Your language is the language that is taught during designated ELD, ideally should be connected to the language needs of the content. So quick example, this is where collaboration is key. If during designated ELD, I'm focusing on specific language structures that are past tense, then maybe I could either connect with the history teacher, or maybe if I'm the history teacher, I can look at the history lesson and make connection with those past tense words, because history text, most of it is written in the past tense. And that's why I'm using history as an example. Again, just a brief example of what that description might look like. For designated ELD, obviously, our objective is language acquisition. So you have a language objective. The ELD standards are your focal standards. Designated ELD is a specific time during the day, every day. It is a protected time, like math is, like science, like language arts. Your students are grouped by proficiency level. It may not always be the case if you don't have enough ELs to create a class, but that is your goal. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a class. It could be a group of kiddos that you're providing direct instruction of English language based on the ELD standards, but those groups, if it's not a class, must be the same proficiency level. And the specific demands are the topic or the focus are the specific demands of the proficiency levels, which is why you want your students to be grouped by proficiency level. So right down the middle, what do we have in common? What we have in common are the ELD standards. The ELD standards are at the very top because that is what we use to design and deliver comprehensive ELD. It is designed to support for all English learners, including English learners with disability. It helps support the development of English language. It is not dependent upon a program. And that goes back to Raul's question. Comprehensive ELD is designed for all English learners, regardless of the program. Program meaning your dual immersion programs. It is rigorous content. Why? Because it is standards-based. In integrated ELD, you're using your content standards and your ELD standards. In designated ELD, you're using your ELD standards. So it is rigorous content because it is standards-based. You have a qualified teacher. And, earlier today, when we talked about, special education teachers being qualified to provide comprehensive ELD, absolutely, yes, you can, if you have that authorization, and most of us do. It is across disciplines. Again, even designated ELD, you're not teaching language in a vacuum. You have a specific topic. And so that topic could be related to something that you are focusing on during integrated ELD. Again, you're designing your lessons, right? And it happens daily. So again, this is a very brief, very quick recap of the Venn diagram. Again, not an exhaustive list, but it's a way to help begin the conversation and identify areas of need and perhaps some professional development need around this very important topic. And as a reminder, a comprehensive ELD is part of Tier 1 core instruction. It is not an intervention. However, there may be a need for interventions in ELD for some students. Vanessa shared the alarming percentage of long-term English learners. They may need some additional support in ELD, and therefore that's where the Tier 2 or perhaps even Tier 3 support may be necessary. But by definition, by design, comprehensive ELD is part of an English learner's Tier 1 core instruction and not special education service. Next slide, please. We have another activity that we want to share with you. We won't have time to explore it today, but this is a Jamboard activity that we created to help teams, school sites identify their tiers of instruction and support activities or interventions or best practices. So we want to leave this here with you for you to explore with your teams at your site to help kind of organize and reorganize what is currently happening in terms of the tiers of support. So we don't have the time to explore it here today, but again, it works very similar to the Venn diagram. We also have these 3 infographics that are interactive. They have live links in each one of them. Once you pop one of the infographics open, it'll take you to different resources and videos to help paint a concrete picture of what tier 1 core instruction is, what tier intervention is, and what tier 2 interventions are, and what tier 3 interventions are. So again, we've created these because we're trying to be very responsive to what practitioners are asking for. And so this is a way for us to share with you some ideas to help enhance. After you do the Jamboard activity and you organize your supports, maybe you explore the tiers of instruction infographics and reorganize your supports. Next slide, please. The next slide is a compilation of all the tools that we've shared with you up to this point and an additional one. Vanessa, can you pop open the note-taking guide, please? So when you pop open the note-taking guide, this is a way to really capture the information that you will be gathering once you utilize the tools that we've shared with you today, the infographics, the Jamboard, and the Venn diagram activity. And they're all linked on the note-taking guide as well, so that you're able to engage in these tools with your professional learning communities, perhaps, your staffs. It could be part of a staff meeting or professional development, and gather that information together. So again, the design here is for you to be able to enhance your current practices so that we are providing the appropriate supports that our English learners who are struggling need in the form of comprehensive ELD, as well as our English learners with disabilities who also need and must have comprehensive ELD. Next slide, please. I'm rushing a little bit because I'm very well of the time, but know that all of the tools and resources that we've shared with you up to this point can be accessed on the slide deck. I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa, who's going to give you a few more resources. So make room in your toolbox because we just have a few more resources we want to share with you, this time specifically on the topic of assessment. Vanessa, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lupita. So we're going to take it home in the next 24 minutes. I want to make sure that when we're having the conversation around the assessment of multilingual students with exceptional needs, we keep in mind all of the points that we've covered up until now. Why? Because that is what's truly going to be supportive of us making those appropriate decisions on when to advance between the tiers of instruction and when we can actually start making considerations that are related to the assessment for formal assessment for special education services. So let's jump into it. So the content that we're going to be sharing with you today is largely out of Chapter 4. Chapter 4 of the Practitioner's Guide is all about assessment for English learners for identification as students with disabilities. So the chapter is organized in this manner. It starts off with questions that are relevant for teachers or practitioners. And then for administrators, because the content can be dense and it's really important for us to be responsive to the needs of the field and also practice what we preach by giving you a UDL designed for the content that is included in Chapter 4. We developed a visual guide that you can pop open by clicking the link that takes you to the infographic that helps scaffold the information and give you a visual framework of how the content is organized in the chapter. So again, a tool for you to refer back to if you want to explore a little bit more deeply specific content related to the assessment of English learners as potential students who meet eligibility criteria for special education. So IDEA has quite a few requirements. And one of these is that all students referred for assessment to determine eligibility receive an assessment that meets these specific requirements. And we've linked these here because it can be a little burdensome with the legalese, but we want to make sure that you have the appropriate citation to refer back to as we're making some informed changes, informed refinements, and maybe even, just really reinforcing the fact that what we are engaging with is in fact appropriate for multilingual students. So what is key here is the following. We want to ensure that assessments are administered in the child's native language or other mode of communication. Why is this? Because we wanted to yield the most accurate information of what the child knows, can do academically, developmentally, and functionally. Here's where we get stuck. Unless it is clearly not feasible to do so. Earlier, when we looked at the graphic of the home languages in the state of California, we saw that Spanish was the primary one, right? And then we have lower and lower percentages, and even the graph didn't have a space for many of the dialects and other languages that we know are spoken statewide. So when we are making determinations as to whether we have the most accurate information that paints a robust profile of what the student can do academically, functionally, developmentally, we want to have enough tools in our toolkit to be able to collect information to further enhance that profile. What we've linked here are some data gathering tools that are going to support these discussions as you're having these meetings prior to that referral for assessment, as you're having those MTSS meetings when you're considering groups of students or individual students to be moving from tier 1 to tier 2 or tier 3. So it's important for us to know what it is that we are looking for, which is what makes these tools so valuable. The CUME file can be a treasure trove of information, but it can be overwhelming. What exactly am I looking for that is going to impact my decision on whether an assessment is appropriate for a multilingual learner, or whether they need to be considered for additional tiers of intervention? The CUME file check Appendix 3.2 gives you a structured framework for you to engage in this scavenger hunt of the CUME file. There's areas that can be fillable, whether you want to print out the form, do it paper, pencil, pen style, or electronically. That format is readily available for you. Also, earlier, Lupita touched upon the need for us to consider on extrinsic factors, and that was further highlighted and echoed with some of you in the chat saying that we need to consider more than language. We want to consider cultural factors, extrinsic factors. Appendix 3.3 gives you a framework for you to consider that as well and have these conversations in that SST meeting, in that MTSS meeting for the student. Also, because we want to make sure that as we're traveling between the tiers, we have a tool to collect information related to how the student is doing. What are the areas of concerns? What are the types of supports and programs or instruction that's being provided to the student, and what those outcomes are? Appendix 3.4 gives you that format as well. So again, just like the other appendices that we have been sharing up until now and will continue to do throughout our time together today, these are downloadable, printable, fillable. You can save locally to your desktop or print out and have a traditional file for some of your students. These are great resources for you to engage in data gathering and data collection to make appropriate recommendations as we navigate through the tiers of instruction and intervention and consider potential assessment for special education. And then finally, critical to our discussion is the English Learner Student Questionnaire of Language Use. So as we're considering language specific needs for the student, we also want to know exactly how it is that they use language. Did they first learn how to speak? What language was it? Was English their primary language? Were they doing it concurrently? Because again, this helps illustrate what the student can do in their primary language and how it is that they're most comfortable utilizing language. And it starts giving you an idea of where it is that you want to focus your attention to as you're engaging in these discussions. So let's take a step forward in time to the development of the assessment plan. So we're having all of these data gathering tools, we're having all of these meetings, we're moving students from tier 2 to tier 3 interventions as needed, we're documenting how it is that they're doing, they're retaining tier 1 core first best instruction, which is inclusive of comprehensive ELD, and still we're seeing no progress. So absolutely appropriate then to start considering the assessment plan, developing an assessment plan. Before we do that, we want to make sure that when we are developing the assessment plan, that it is in a language that is easily understood by the general public. And I know that's hard with special education jargon, which can be a little bit intimidating, but we want to ensure that parents know what it is that they are reading and that it would be comprehensible to most members of the general public. We want to provide it in the primary language of the parent or guardian or other mode of communication, and explain the assessments, what they are, and which ones are going to be conducted. And also, it must state that no IEP will result without the consent of the parent, meaning the actual development of the program and implementation of the program. So the California Code of Regulations has very specific language and additional requirements for assessment plans for students who are multilingual learners, English learners. So in addition to the assessment plan, we want to ensure that we have a description of any recent assessment conducted, including any available independent assessments and any assessment information the parent requests to be considered. But most importantly, information indicating a pupil's primary language and the pupil's language proficiency in the primary language as determined. Let's move back in time a couple of slides back. You have all of those appendices to help you fulfill this requirement, specifically the student's language use, where you're finding out how it is that the student communicates best in a variety of contexts in relation to their primary language and the second language that they are learning. Okay, assessment. First best option. So we've talked about navigating the tiers of instruction, where tier 1 is first best instruction. And then if, as a student needs additional supports, going through tier 2, tier 3, the importance of assessing, even if it's curriculum-based measures, or even if it's curriculum-based assessments. If you have tools in the primary language, it's important for us to know that so we can draw that comparison. But when we're talking about formal assessment for special education services, we want to ensure that we first administer cross-cultural, non-discriminatory assessments that align to the referral concerns. Okay, so the analysis of the data should indicate that the student is performing. If the data indicates that the student is performing at the average or above average range, there is likely no disability. However, we still want to make sure that we assess the student in their primary language in relative or related or suspected areas of weakness to confirm scores using fully bilingual assessors. Okay, so first best option, cross-cultural, non-discriminatory assessments that address all areas of concern. If average, above average, there is likely no disability. However, we want to still assess the student in their primary language in those areas of relative or suspected areas of weakness, just to confirm. If the student does not perform in the average or above average range in English, engage in primary language assessment in all areas of concern. Engage in structured interviews with the parent and staff. Engage in observation of the student in varied environments, and collect data from curriculum-based and criterion-based assessment measures to validate those potential areas of concerns and strength as compared to like peers. Okay, so you would not compare to an English only student, you would compare to an English learner student, right? Because you want to ensure that you're comparing like groups. So if you noted in the previous slide, they talked about engaging with the parent and engaging with the teacher. Appendices 4.2 and 4.4 are a tool for you to do just that. We don't know what to ask if we don't know what to ask. What exactly am I looking for? Especially if these are not practices that are deeply ingrained or that are new to you or that you're becoming familiar with or are hoping to build a little bit more fluency and structure to. These two appendices allow you to have a very structured conversation geared towards collecting relevant data to make these appropriate determinations. These two appendices, just like the other ones, are downloadable, fillable, and printable, and provide you with a framework of sorts to, again, keep building that student profile, that robust student profile that takes into consideration more than just how the student is doing and what they sound like and what they write like, without the appropriate consideration to that general progression against the language acquisition arc. So because we love to overflow your toolkit, we have provided you also Appendix 4.6, 4.7, and 4.8. Why? Because when we are looking at that slide with the first best assessment, right? First best option for assessment, we talk about assessing in the primary language, but also collecting additional data. And one of those incredibly important pieces are those observations. But again, if we go back to my earlier statement, if you don't know what you're looking for, you don't know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're asking for, you don't know what you're asking for. So Appendix 4.6, 4.7, and 4.8 individually give you a structure to do just that. 4.6 is all about the English learner in the classroom. So you're looking at the environment, you're looking at the instructional procedure, you're looking at the pedagogy. Then you are using 4.7 for a focused observation of the English learner during English instruction. So how is a student doing when English is being taught, right? And then finally, Appendix 4.8 is the parent report for the individual education program development, right? So again, some of the information that you would document if you had an IEP already in the present levels page, but however, this is a great tool, not just for the development of the IEP, but also for the development of that robust student profile, where a critical element is that parent lens, that guardian lens, because as Lupita shared earlier, some of our students may be unaccompanied minors. And we might be missing certain elements that if the parent is not there present, well, who could the next best person be to provide what the student is like in the home environment? Or who may have connection to the parent back home, wherever home may be, to help complete this information. So again, tools to help you make those informed determinations. And if you're wondering, okay, Vanessa, great, first best instruction, but even Spanish, I don't know what's out there. Well, what we have shared with you today in this slide are a list of potential bilingual assessment tools. And these were compiled by Dr. Jerese Butterfield. And they are truly a great tool. So let me pop it up briefly, just so that you can get an idea as to how the document is organized, so that when you share out with your peers, you can walk them through the process. So Appendix 4.1 is, again, a great resource. However, it may not be exhaustive. So when we're looking at language assessment tools, here you have a description of the test name and publisher, the age and or grade range, and a description of the assessment. So you are going to see that, yes, most of these are in Spanish. Why? That percentage that we saw in that pie chart. You also will have assessments for cognitive assessment tools, nonverbal cognitive assessment tools, social emotional related assessments, academic bilingual assessment tools, speech and language assessment tools, and that is it. Okay, so you have this resource as a starting point for you to share out with your teams and to engage in a deep dive as to what is out there, what is available locally, because we know that just because there's this list out there doesn't mean that every district, every site is equipped with all of these tools. Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Vanessa. We have that list. You told us about the first best option, but I remember you sharing a slide that said, unless it is not feasible. What does that mean? Okay, glad you asked. If it is not feasible to engage in the first best assessment option because no assessor is available in the primary language, there are additional options for you and teams to consider. The second option is for you to use a trained interpreter. And this trained interpreter is going to administer the primary language assessment under the supervision of a licensed assessor and document the limitations in the assessment report of the student. This is a good second option because the other is not feasible because no assessor is available in the primary language. There's a third option too. And the third option, you would use an interpreter who speaks the primary language to provide an oral translation of assessments normed and written in English. Be sure to document any limitations due to this condition in the assessment report, and do not report the standardized test scores because it wasn't delivered in a standardized manner. But do document the patterns of strengths and weaknesses. The fourth option, which is typically what we see, the first best option and then the fourth option, and we skip over the second and third, is to assess in English to include nonverbal areas of cognition. If the student shows low cognition or there are patterns of weakness, then attempt to validate with non-standardized data collection. And again, a lot of the appendices that I shared with you earlier would be great resources for you to collect data to then supplement and inform this fourth option. If second option was tried and not available or not feasible, third option was tried or not available or not feasible. However, we find that once practitioners or bilingual assessors or assessors in general find out that the second option is an option, that the third option is an option, then they get a little bit more comfortable with trying out these ways of assessing students. So a trained interpreter does not have to be necessarily an employee of the school district. Obviously, check with your site-based administration first, check with your district-based administration first, but we've seen it where community members, if there's a church community where that primary language or dialect is spoken, train that interpreter to administer the primary language assessment under your supervision or the assessor supervision. And also maybe utilize an interpreter who speaks a primary language to give that oral translation to the student. But again, know that there are options available for us to get a truer idea profile of how the student does in their primary language as opposed to just that second language. If you are going to be using interpreters for bilingual assessments, prepare. Make sure that you have time with your interpreter to let them know what tests are being administered and for you to know and be organized with that. To be prepared for the assessment to take extra time. Ensure that the interpreter speaks the same dialect because we might have an understanding that, oh yeah, you know, like I think they said that he speaks Quechua and then it's not Quechua. Administer only the tests that the interpreter has been trained to assist in administering. Prepare for the assessment and then debrief with the interpreter. So again, preparation is key when we are using bilingual assessors. So
Vanessa, I'm sorry.
yes.
We need to skip to the very end.
Okay. All right. So to wrap it up, I know we have 3 minutes left. We wanted to give you a capstone, right, for the time together today. So if you're looking for a quick and easy checklist to establish whether we're looking at how the student learns, how the student does best, we have resources that are included here in these last slides that help us ensure that students are that instruments that are used are valid, that they evaluate specific areas of need, that reflect aptitude, not sensory limitations or lack of English language fluency, as we engage in non-discriminatory evaluation practices. So one of the ways that you can do this is by engaging with this Google form. This Google form was developed as a checklist, as a reflection for culturally and linguistically comprehensive assessments for English learners, and it's a self-assessment. So you can complete it on your own. You can have a redacted report. You can have your community of practice, your PLC come together, look at a redacted report or your own individual reports, go through the checklist and see if all elements are addressed in the reports. If yes, congratulations. How can we share the knowledge and explore and support to other assessors who may not be there yet? If after completing that self-assessment, the answer is no, all elements were not addressed, well, this is a brave space. You should provide a brave space for yourself. What are some obstacles that may have kept the assessor from meeting each element in the assessment practice and or the report? And how might we ensure moving forward that our assessments will be conducted and reports written that ensure cultural and linguistically sensitive practices? Because we know that can be a really nuanced conversation, it's important for us to have a tool that allows us to have a depersonalized conversation. And resources and documents like this really help us walk through the process without having it be taken personal. Let's look at what the process looks like. Let's look at the checklist. Let's look at some supports so that we can engage in the appropriate practices for supporting our students, because it really is our collective commitment. In ensuring the academic success and linguistic progress and social emotional well-being of English learners with disabilities is a shared responsibility of all members of the school system. When we are working together with parents, families, school and district professionals, then we can promote and ensure educational equity by ensuring that all multilingual learners participate in the highest quality teaching and learning experiences. And now I know that I probably talked super fast, but I want to make sure that we make ourselves available for you should you have any questions and answers. Hopefully we have the answers if you have the questions. So I'll hand it back to Susan, Jen, and the team.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanessa and Lupita. So much information and great resources. I know this wealth, this treasure trove that you've given us today, people are rapidly looking for those resources, and I can tell that they're planning to use them. We will give Lupita and Vanessa's email address at the very end, so you'll be able to see that. But before you go, we really would like for you to complete a poll. It's a feedback evaluation. It's very important to us. We knew that the information that was provided in the webinar last year by Lupita and Vanessa was so valuable from your feedback that we brought them back, and they have once again exceeded our expectations. So please complete that survey and let us know. And I would like for you, Vanessa, to move on to the last slide, which has both the contact information for Lupita and Vanessa at Imperial County, and also those of us at SPP-TAP. And you also have some information about CDEs, accessing CDE's information. So thank you all very much. We'll leave the window open for a little bit so that you'll have a chance to complete that evaluation. Lupita and Vanessa, thank you so much.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.